either by Zoom or by phone. And as always, we have used Zoom for prior meetings, and we hope that you can receive some good information from this. Also, a YouTube link is always emailed to you, and a survey after the meeting's over. So we do hope that you would complete the survey and send it back to us with your comments, and also any subjects that you would like to be covered for our coalition. The PARS Safe Street staff joining us today are Michelle Voth, Executive Director, Prevention Recovery Services, Lynn Smith, Community Prevention Consultant, Dana Schwartz, Licensed Addiction Counselor, Irene Caballero, Grant Coordinator and Bilingual Community Mobilizer, Michaela Butterworth, Education and Communication Specialist, and I'm Judy Wilson, Office Manager and National Night Out Program Coordinator. Of course, you know, you can contact any of our staff by email, and we're glad to answer any questions you might have. We do have the agenda published for you today. We try to do this just for your information. Our next meeting will be on December the 2nd. At each meeting, we normally recognize a champion of character, and I have emailed the champion of character nomination form to you. So if you would like to nominate someone exhibiting good character that has significantly improved the health, safety, or quality of life of the community, be sure and complete the form and email it back to me. Any of the 49 different qualities can be considered for a champion of character. So anyone in Shawnee County can be nominated by completing the nomination form. We do have the October minutes before you. Of course, these were emailed to you, but this is just for your information. And it will be on the YouTube, so you'll have that as well. Okay, for our staff report. For neighborhood watch meetings, of course, we can't meet in person at this time. So we do email safety information to all of our neighborhoods. This month, we did send information to 140 neighborhoods, and that would be a reach of about 2,100 people. The Oakland community meeting was held to discuss issues in their area with about 40 present. As you may have noticed, a Safe Streets article did appear in the Topeka Capital Journal and also on CJ Online. Right before that article was published, Alpha Media interviewed Trooper Don Hughes, Fire Chief Craig Duke, and me on safety tips through the StreamYard platform, and it was live streamed on Facebook, WIBW News, WIBW AM Danielle Norwood Show. Of course, the Safe Property Management Training, you may have also seen that advertised in the paper. We do this twice a year, and this training is geared towards apartment managers and workers, landlords, and those who might become landlords. This year, we had 13 people attend and 9 speakers. Even though the retailers and IFO meeting was not held in October, meeting information was emailed to the 122 people. You know, we are still working from home, but we did have 333 emails and calls for services during the month. If you would, check out the Facebook pages. LIRI is the Lock It, Remove It, or Lose It Facebook page. Then we have NNO Facebook. That would be any updates on NNO planning or events. And also the Safe Streets Coalition Facebook. And there we also share information. And so on the substance abuse initiatives, we do have the Substance Abuse Task Force that met this year or this month by Zoom, and there were 14 attending that. And you should also check the Prevention Recovery Services PARS Facebook page. Right now we had 384 people who did check that website or that Facebook page. On the Latino initiatives, there were 3 different presentations by Zoom and on Facebook. And then we had the ADIS Spanish training And the Tino Facebook page this month was 1,406. Normally, on the crime stats, we have members of the Topeka Police Department who attend to update you on this. But due to COVID quarantines and other issues, they're not able to be with us today. So I'll go through this a little bit with you. On the city violent crimes, there were 11 more crimes this month than last. But for the difference for the year, we were just up 6. Now you'll notice that there were 23 more on aggravated assault battery charged for this month. Some of the others were down. So they're paying particular interest in checking those out. On the city property crime, of course, with the lock it, remove it, and lose it, people are watching what they have in their cars, but you'll notice that they're still retrieving guns from automobiles. So they want to remind us all to be sure and do not leave guns in your car anywhere, whether it's in the glove compartment or under the seat or wherever. The difference from last month, of course, we're down 40, and for the year, we're down 205. So that's a really good number there. Normally, too, we have Deputy Abigail Christian from the Shawnee County Sheriff's Office with us, but she's unable to attend today. They did have training. So she wanted me to reference her slide that she sent, that you could call the Shawnee County Sheriff's Office at 251-2200 to report any issues or check on their website or Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, or to reach out to Sheriff Brian Hill. Of course, their highest priority is to keep the people and property of Shawnee County safe. Next, we have Michelle Voth, who's our Executive Director, and she will introduce our speaker, Dana Schwartz.
Ms. Voth, I think you're muted.
It would help if I would unmute myself, wouldn't it? Anyway, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us at lunchtime today. I'm excited to introduce Dana Schwartz. If you don't know Dana, I think you'll know a little bit more about her and some of the work that she does for PARS. Just to give you some background, Dana graduated from Washburn University with a bachelor's in nursing and worked as an ER nurse and in rural medicine prior to going back to Washburn University and getting her licensed addiction counselor degree and master's of arts with addictions counseling in 2015. She also has experience working with the Kansas Juvenile Complex, and her area of focus is and really passion is with youth. And I think that will come through in her presentation today. In her free time, she works, has lots of fun time with her husband, although during this COVID, it's been interesting. Her husband is a middle school principal, so that's been a whole new world for her life, and in addition to the children that she works with at home. And anyway, I want to welcome Dana to talk about a very important issue, and even more so in this day and age right now with COVID. So Dana, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. This is so weird. I'm so used to presenting to people, like being out up in public and being able to see everyone fall asleep as I'm talking, as opposed to them being able to hide themselves behind screens. It's a different feeling for me to be doing it via Zoom. We're going to talk about some trauma and the relationship between trauma and addiction. It's kind of it really is a passion of mine, because I'm one of the believers that don't believe that that addiction just happens in this chasm, that things never happen to people, that they just decided one day they were going to use drugs or were around alcohol and drinking and started doing it, and all of a sudden it just became an issue. I'm truly a believer that alcohol and drugs are solving a problem, for a lot of our youth, especially, but also for adults, where they feel it's solving a problem. It's actually creating more problems. But so one of the very first things I want to do, Irene, I should ask you first, do I have the ability to share my slides or share my screen?
I'm going to make you a co-host right now.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So one of the things that I'm going to kind of do this backwards from how I do it when I do a presentation for people out in public. I'm going to show you some what I consider to be ridiculous statistics. But nonetheless, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Say yes. Okay, yay, good. So this is off of a presentation that I do. It's a much longer presentation, but for today's purposes, I really wanted to show these statistics of why having, I'm sorry? Okay, so why having ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, and we're gonna talk more about that here in just a minute, but why having adverse childhood experiences really does correlate with the crime prevention side of things. The study that was done back in 1997, and we'll talk about that, but out of that study, we've found some new correlations, one of which is that the higher an ACE score is, that we've seen an increase in smoking, heavy drinking, incarceration, which to be incarcerated, one thinks, we hope that you've actually committed the crime, that you're not there, unfortunately, even though you haven't committed the crime. Morbid obesity, increased risk for poor educational employment outcomes, and recent involvement in violence. So of those things, we can already put our finger on a few of them that are going to be criminal issues. It also increases your risk of having 50 or more sexual intercourse partners by the age of 15. I have two almost 15, well, one is 15, and another one that's almost 15 in my home. And it's a little scary to me to think that at this point in time, they could have 50 sexual partners. Yet we know that it happens. Children who have experienced abuse are 9 times more likely to become involved in criminal activity. And a male child with an ACEs score of 6 or more has actually it's over 4,000, it's 4,106% chance, more likely of becoming an addict or an alcoholic. 4,000% higher of a chance. It's a pretty substantial increase in your odds of developing what we now know can be a terminal chronic lifelong illness. And so when we start talking about trauma, this is why I think trauma is such a huge part of what we need to address when we look at our society and our safety measures. Of course, we don't want people dealing drugs in the homes next door to us. We don't want people who are using around our children and in our homes. And I totally agree with that. But I think as a society, we have to look at this and say, okay, why is this happening? So when we talk about that, the adverse childhood experiences was actually a study that was done by Kaiser Permanente in 1997, which is substantially a while ago. But when we start talking about history versus research, it's pretty new with research. So the study was done in 1997. It looked at 17,000 middle class, please hear that word, middle class people who had insurance. And it was done trying to figure out why morbid obesity was becoming such a problem for our society. And so they were trying to find the correlation between morbid obesity and behaviors and all of those kinds of things and what the relationship was. And what they actually ended up finding was that there was a study, and during the study there was a woman that they were working with, and this woman had lost a phenomenal amount of weight, 250 pounds, I believe, is somewhere along those lines. And then all of a sudden she started gaining substantial amount of weight back, like 18 pounds in a week, which is almost thought to be medically impossible. And what they found was when they started interviewing this woman, She said that she had an older man who had sexually propositioned her at work, and it had triggered responses from her that were childhood responses because she had had sexual abuse in her childhood, and her way of managing that and those responses was to eat. And so she was triggered, her trauma response was triggered, and she started trying to eat away all of her emotions and feelings, which was all this weight gain. So that changed the whole study. They started looking at all of these common questions of childhood experiences before the age of 18 to see what were in common. And when they did that, they came up with a set of 10 questions that are considered to be it's not all inclusive. So I will tell you there are things on here that I feel like should be on, or aren't on here that I think should be on here. But this is kind of the questionnaire that we go through now and look at the whether or not you have a high ACEs score. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to ask anyone, but if you haven't done this, it's really enlightening to answer these questions for yourself and see where you score. So there's 10 different questions. They're yes or no questions. If they happen to you prior to you're turning 18 years of age, then the answer is yes. If it happened after the age of 18, then the answer is no. So if you'll just kind of go through these and answer. Can you see my whole screen, Irene, or just, is it, yeah, okay, you can see the whole questionnaire?
Yes,
Awesome.
well, right now we can see just from 1 to 4, so maybe you have to scroll down.
Through 4, so just a minute. How about now?
5.
It's so small you can't
There
read
you
it.
go, now it's
Guys are
small. Is there a link that they can go, Dana? Maybe it could be.
I'm not sure. Yes, there is. I'll have to. Do we send out information afterwards? Because I can send it out after.
I think yes, because we're gonna send that the video that we're recording, and we can definitely add the link where they can.
Yeah,
I can put it in the chat if you want.
That would be great. If you don't
Okay,
mind,
give me just a moment.
That.
Yeah, you bet.
And, okay, so I'll let you go through and answer the first 4 questions here, and then I'll scroll down. Hopefully everybody's through 1 and 2. You can go ahead and answer those. And I've done this a million times. Thankfully, those things don't change after you turn 18. They kind of are set in stone. The answers are what they are.
Okay, the link's going in right now.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And scroll down to see it.
Okay, so when you have circled yes, or when you're gone through all of these, go ahead and add up how many of them you say yes to. Everybody had enough time?
Dana, did you do a trigger warning?
I did not.
Okay.
Because we're not going to get super in depth here. We're just going to stay pretty on the surface with this stuff. Yes, if you have a traumatic history, or even if you don't, sometimes the things that we'll talk about will trip that. And if you start feeling kind of stressed out or emotional or any of those things, please feel free to step away. Take some time to gather yourself. Contact one of us if you need to discuss anything, any of those kinds of things. We're more than happy to have that conversation with you. Okay, so the reason I want everyone to kind of know this is that if you are in the population of the world today who is under the age of 18, 50% of our marriages are ending in divorce. So if you are a child of one of those, you automatically have a 1. So the higher your ACEs score, the higher that number is, the correlation is of having problems. Now, not just mental health problems. So we tend to believe that this is all just about mental health, but the reality is that it can put you at risk for all of these things. So obviously alcoholism and alcohol abuse is one of them, illicit drug use, but also depression, fetal death, heart disease, financial stress, intimate partner violence. We talk about domestic violence on a fairly regular basis. It also puts you at risk for that. Multiple sex partners, STDs, COPD, really all of the things that we as a society tell you we don't want you to have, you have a higher risk for. So as your risk factors go up, hopefully you can still see it. Can you still see the screen, or did it change with me or not? Okay, it changed, okay. So the pyramid goes up. So the higher risk factors you have, the greater the risk you have for all of these things, up to the point that it's statistically, they've looked at it, 8 out of 10, you can count about 20 years off of your life expectancy because of the physical health and the emotional health problems that go along with your trauma reactions and stress reactions. So where does trauma come from? Any ideas? I like interaction. Feel free to throw something out there, guys. It's the worst part about Zoom. You're talking to yourself half the time. Anybody?
Brain chemicals.
Brain chemicals.
Trauma.
Brain chemicals, reactions. Any other ideas? So basically what happens is with trauma, something happens to you. So I use the example, a good friend of mine from high school, one of my best friends from high school, their house was hit by an F4 tornado. They were in the basement of their house when it hit. It was incredibly traumatic for their 5 children. As for them, they lost everything in the tornado. And now every time the weather looks like it might storm, guess where the kids are? Right in bed with mom and dad, every time. Why is that?
Because they're scared.
Yeah, so we had this huge traumatic event that happened, and my brain remembers that, wait a minute, when this happened, then this potentially happens, and this can happen, and this can happen, and so therefore my brain remembers how that is all of those things that happened to me and expects me to do something differently to protect myself. So when we start talking about trauma and those traumatic experiences, it's always based on the perspective of the person who has suffered the trauma. Meaning, you could have an entire family who's gone through the same thing, but only part of them, or even maybe one of them, interprets that as being a traumatic experience that they still struggle with later on down the road. Because based on their resiliency, the things that they have that have built them up, that are taking care of them, they're protecting them, or based on how they interpreted the individual event or series of events, they see it differently. And so therefore they get stuck. So then we have people who try to get away from that. They try to escape from those emotions. They try to escape from that feeling. And that's where you get the introduction of alcohol and drugs. So the reason that for me it's such a strong pull, especially with adolescents, is we know with adolescents that if we can intervene prior to the age of 18, even if they have substance use prior to the age of 18, but we can provide some kind of intervention and get some kind of sobriety and abstinence. Long-term abstinence is the best. Long-term abstinence defined by SAMHSA is 1 year, which is ridiculous to me to think that that's a long term. I've had shoes in my closet longer than that I have a relationship with. So it's really hard to think that that dictates a long-term fix, but it does in substance use. So we know that if we can get an adolescent with some sobriety under their belt when they're younger, before the age of 18, the likelihood of them going on to develop a full-blown addiction later on in life is much less. Or if they do go on to have addiction problems, they're much more likely to get into treatment and into a recovery program than they would be if they were left unattended without any kind of treatment before the age of 18. So this is a really broad subject. There's a lot of discussion in this. It's really not something, it's such a, there's so many different facets that come into trauma and addiction. But I think the biggest thing is to realize, at least from our Safe Streets component, and we have these conversations all the time in the office of how do we know the connection is there. We know that there's a connection between alcohol and drug use and crime. Not even just the fact that using those things can be a crime, but the fact is that there's people supporting those habits by acting in criminal ways as a survival skill. They're legitimately trying to survive things that they no longer feel that they can do it without any kind of substance use. The other side of it to remember is that for a lot of people, they don't understand anything different than what they're living right now. So therefore, if they've lived a life of traumatic experiences since the young ages, their likelihood of continuing those traumatic events is pretty high. They're going to reproduce what they know. So that becomes where intervention becomes even more important. What other questions can I answer? What is interesting to people that they want to know? Feel free to pick my brain if you would like to. Nothing.
Dana, you know what? I think that sometimes when we see the ACEs questionnaire for the first time, it looks very simple, kind of. As you say, there are a lot of phases of the different questions, but do you have in mind, and I'm gonna put you on the spot right now, a case or something where you really connected that life or that case with some of the ACEs thing? I know all of them, but all of them, but maybe one that you're like, oh yeah, like, or the correlation when you say, wow, you have so many, like how do you see as a trend when you work with people between what's going on and the ACEs or a case or something?
Sure. So I think the overall trend for me that I see, especially with adolescents, you see it with adults too, but adults don't tend to, I think they're afraid to articulate it. Whereas kids are usually brutally honest. My teenagers have no problems telling me how they feel about certain things. They will throw every word out there under the sun to tell you and describe it. So, but I think one of the things that I continue to hear, like the reoccurring theme, is the lack of connection. I don't feel like there is anyone in my life that I feel connected, and not just like, oh yeah, I mean, my kids live in my house, right? So we're connected because we live in the same home, but truly feel like people are invested. We have an entire population, an entire generation that's growing up feeling like there's a missing connection there. And I think technology, as much as I hate to say that, even though we're all sitting here gathered together, we're not together. It's not the same feeling. It's not the same connection as it would be if you are in the same personal space. And I feel like that is, we can all empathize with that right now at a whole nother level than what we could have even a year ago. Because we've all had to go through some kind of quarantine or isolation or restriction of how we've done things. So therefore we can understand the not feeling connected at some level. And for a lot of the kids that we work with and adults, because I tend to always go towards the kids side of things, but for that population, the people feel like there's a missing connection. They don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like there's a connection to anything, that people understand them, that they matter in this world. And so therefore, when I ask you, why would you do something that's going to potentially harm you or kill you? Well, it doesn't matter, because I don't feel like I'm connected. I don't feel like I fit anywhere. So what I'm doing to myself is no longer even a question that I ask. So I would say that, and why they don't feel connected, those reasons, like there's a million of those reasons. Some of them is childhood abuse, some of them is neglect, some of them it is a perception. Maybe it's been I'm running into a lot of domestic violence in teenagers. We talk about it in the past, we've talked about it, but it looks different sometimes now because of technology, but it's still abuse. And kids aren't equipped to deal with that kind of stuff. They don't understand the emotional manipulation that goes along with it, and so therefore they feel very isolated. They can't tell. So there's a whole gamut of why people don't feel connected. And I think the feeling connected is just so incredibly important right now. With COVID going on, we're doing everything that we can to protect everyone's physical health, and I applaud that, and I want that I more than everyone, but I don't want us to forget that when we have such policies that are isolating others and people in our population, that mental health and emotional health starts to decline. Because that connection, even for people who are healthy, you're losing that emotional connection with people. So it's so important right now to be checking on each other, to be having some kind of conversation with each other, to be able to have that connection so you don't feel like you're so isolated. I was telling my coworkers this morning, I really struggled with the time change. It's really messing with my world this time around, and it usually doesn't. But I think that's just kind of like one more thing on top of the cake, right? Like you can't go here, you can't go there, we've got to do this, we've got to do that. My kids' schools have changed. My husband works 70 hours a week. It's just everything has changed. And now this was just one more change on top of the cake that I really wasn't ready for. So I think the interesting thing for me will come out of COVID is how much of the traumatic effects will we see will be a lasting imprint on our environment moving forward. What other questions? Irene, I hope that answered your question. More people that are addicted to alcohol or other drugs. It depends on who we are talking about. Under the age of 18, I by far and away see marijuana. It is by far and away the #1 drug. Kids nowadays, I don't see a lot of alcohol. Maybe hit and miss. Most of them will tell me, yuck, it's gross. I don't like the taste of it. I don't like the smell of it. I don't want anything to do with it. So I would say the trend has been in the last probably year to 2 years has really been marijuana, and then prescription Xanax. Those are my 2 highest in Shawnee County that I see in youth by far. Adults, it's kind of it's a much harder way to gauge, because adults tend to have one thing that they like, but they may switch it around a couple of different times. So if I'm on probation because I have a DUI, I'm not going to drink, but I might use meth because it's out of my system quicker. And so you have a lot more things that get shuffled around and in exchange for things to try to kind of beat the system or manipulate the system. I would still say alcohol is probably one of the top runners for the adults that I see, though. And there was a question as to whether or not it's vaping the marijuana. Interestingly enough, here as of late, I am seeing vaping and edibles. So if you're not aware, we have a lot of legalization around us at some form or another. So we are seeing an influx of both, actually. I see vaping, I see some just kids talking about weed and blunts, but a lot of times now I'm seeing edibles and edibles as in gummies or brownies, yes, anything. Literally anything you can think of, they will eat. It blows my mind. We do have dab here, which is another form. It's a more concentrated form of marijuana wax. We do have that here. I don't see it as often, usually because the cost of it is a little more. And so because kids are more limited as to what they can afford, you won't see that quite as much.
What are the last two you mentioned? What are the last two?
Dab.
Yes, what is that?
It's a concentrated, so imagine the wax from your candles containing THC, and the amount that you would use is about the size of a pinhead, but it's as concentrated as a joint. And that's what they smoke, is the actual.
Dana, would it help to say that, to put that into perspective, it's about, what, 94%, Lynn, is that right? THC?
It ranges between 80 and 90, depending on the concentration.
Yeah.
But as Dana was explaining, basically you take that pinhead size of dab, and to elaborate, depending on the final product of how it looks, that's the term that is given. So you have butter, wax, dab. So the butter looks more of a butter consistency. You got wax that's going to look more waxy. You got some that kind of resembles peanut brittle in the consistency of the look. And so as Dana was stating, it's very concentrated. You don't need a lot of it to get high off of it, but also, as Dana stated, it's very costly. So with our young people, which was interesting to hear Dana say, they're now trending towards the vaping, because for a while they weren't. They were still smoking the joints or the blunts or the bongs, whatever their means of getting high, because as it was easier to get and cheaper to buy because it's not as concentrated. The THC level is lower than what you would get from a gummy or an edible or the vapes or the wax. I'm going to shut up now.
Oh, you did great.
Thank you. No, I think one of the reasons that we tend to see, or we're seeing more of the vape, or I'm seeing more, I shouldn't say we, I can't speak to what everybody else is seeing, is that it decreases the smell. So therefore it's way more inconspicuous. So I can be in my bedroom at home or in the school gym or locker room or wherever I can find a little corner. And yes, you may smell a little bit of it when it's first released, but it's nothing like what it is when you're smoking a blunt or marijuana in another fashion. So therefore, that is why I think we're starting to see the trend going that direction. Kids they're smart and they're adaptable. They learn really quick if it's something that's working for them, that how to adapt to those things. I feel like that's probably a lot of the reasons that we're seeing those things. There's other things that I see, but those tend to kind of come in waves. When it's available, basically in society, we see it, and then it'll back off for a while, and then it'll come back again when it's around. Believe it or not, cocaine is another one that's starting to make a resurgence. I'm seeing a lot of kids with cocaine. And a year ago, I would not have seen that. That's an expensive habit. So they're going to be doing things, I mean, people with good jobs have a hard time affording a cocaine habit. So kids who are in school and working a part-time job at Sonic or something along those lines are going to have a much harder time affording those kinds of things.
Dana, I've got a couple things. One, I put it in the chat for everyone. There's a really good website that has good information about marijuana. It talks about legalization, talks about the science, and has one sheet on it that has 2 columns. One is what you're hearing from the media and what the science is saying. So it's learnaboutsam.org, and it's in the chat. The question I have for Dana is, we've had several calls from middle school staff. So I wondered if you'd talk about what you're seeing with middle schoolers right now.
Oh my.
And I want to make a little pause. I just want to mention there is a message in the chat from Taylor Jurgensen, and it says, I work with runaways and I've seen cocaine more and more recently. So I just wanted to make
Taylor,
that.
I will agree with you 110%. It started last summer when I started to see it kind of creeping up. And now I would say cocaine, in order, mine is probably marijuana, Xanax, and cocaine. Those are the ones that I see the most of right now. And Xanax and cocaine, you could probably interchange them back and forth just depending on what day it is and who I'm seeing, and what area of town or county I'm seeing them from. I'm sorry. Oh, middle school. You kind of forgot it. My sweet little middle schoolers. I love middle schoolers. I'm one of those weird people in this world that I just adore them. I think they're great people. They're great kids. They're starting to get minds of their own, and I love that about them. But they're not always the brightest bulbs in the box when it comes to being able to get away with things, which is good for us. So I see a lot of middle schoolers for vaping of tobacco. That is the majority. I will see a few of them for marijuana. It's not a norm that they're taking it to school. Not to say that they're not doing it, but they're not in it enough that they have it abundance with them, that it's going to school with them. But I do see a lot of nicotine, and most of those are vaping, pretty much across the board. I don't remember the last time I had a kid who got caught for cigarettes or chewing tobacco. It's probably been 18 months. So it's always almost across the board vape pens. Easier to get a hold of, easier to hide, easier to smoke, easier to conceal. Everything about it they know is easier. I also have kids who will steal their vape pens from their parents and turn around and sell those and get money for that so they can go buy whatever drugs they want to buy. And that is not super uncommon for me to run across. Any other questions? Information that you would like? I would love to sit here and be able to tell you everything that's in my head about trauma and addiction and why it's so incredibly important as a society that we pay attention to those things, but unfortunately we don't have enough time for that.
Yeah, I have a question. I've been thinking about, just particularly with adults. I know that inpatient rehab is something that people do for like really severe addictions, and I would imagine there are different models of that. Do you know like what the most common model for inpatient rehab is for alcohol or drug addiction? I don't know if that question's too huge.
No, it's, so you're right. There are, CBT is by far and away the most common model that everyone follows with adolescents and adult treatment. So cognitive behavioral therapy, meaning hopefully we're going to teach you to think differently, react differently, and behave differently. So that part of it is pretty much consistent. There are still 12-step based models. So if you're not familiar, the 12 steps have a belief in the higher power involved in that. Some people get caught up in that, and so they don't want to be involved in 12 steps. They don't like the idea of a belief in the higher power. My answer is always I don't care what you believe in, just as long as we can get you sober and keep you sober, that's really what matters to me. But for the most part, at least around here, now you can pay and have some fancier places and do some different things but even those are primarily, their basis is going to be cognitive behavioral therapy.
And Dana, we have a question on the chat from Dwayne. Where are the drugs coming from? Out of the state, out of the country?
Oh, geez. Well, I can tell you my suspicion is, I, of course, don't work on the legal side of it, so I'm not going to go as far as to tell you for sure, but my suspicion is a lot of the marijuana, edibles, vaping, wax, dab, anything marijuana oriented is coming from positive, is coming from legalized states at some level. So whether that's medically and they have a medical card, or they know someone who has a medical card, or they're going to Colorado where it's recreational and they can get it recreationally and coming back across the state line with it. Methamphetamine, manufactured here. There's not a whole lot of running on that one. So it's although we do have some that comes from the cartel and it's the higher dosage or higher strength and things along those lines. Cocaine, I don't know. And there's my honest answer. I can't tell you where cocaine is coming from at this current time. Obviously, we're not making it here. My guess is going to be that it's coming out of the country, but I cannot tell you where the influx is coming from. I wish I could. The Xanax, things like that, my working theory is I have kids that are telling me that they're taking Xanax bars, which means they're taking a larger milligram of Xanax. I have some suspicions that these are just made in the streets and then they're stamping the bars. You can get the stamper over Amazon if you want to, and telling people that they are actually being prescribed that these, oh, hey, my doctor gave me these, blah, blah, blah. So those are kind of the areas that things are coming from. It really depends on what substances, and those are the main substances that we have here. So that's why we're seeing those things. I will tell you, some of the kids that I have seen have had families that have brought stuff back from Colorado. So they went to Colorado, legitimately bought it, legitimately used it there, decided when they left Colorado that they were going to bring home whatever it was that they had, brought it home with them, left it in the house. Mom and dad went on and forgot about it or whatever, and kids found it and used it. And that's not a super uncommon thing either. Anything else?
Well, Bill Kersinger is just saying on cognitive-based treatment approaches, well said, Dana, and agreed. 12 steps is also still a vital piece in the treatment and recovery process.
Yeah, I want to always throw out there with 12-step, because I run across people on a fairly regular basis that are very hesitant to do 12-step because they believe that the higher power, the component that says higher power, means that I have to believe in God or Christianity or whatever those things, religious belief system. I really, it just says you got to believe in something that'll help you stay sober and you can go to. I had a person tell me one time that, you know, if it's the doorknob on that door right there, if it's going to help you stay sober and you can talk to it and make it work for you as your higher power, then you go right ahead. So I think that that's something to always keep in the back of your mind when you run across people who are struggling in that nature. And there are a lot of people who struggle with that idea, is to remember that there's no constraints on what that higher power looks like. You get to create that for yourself. And believe in it however you want to believe in it.
And I just got an email from Dwayne, which is our friend Leslie Cantrell. She said she's using her husband's, and that made me think that we can invite all of you to be part of the Substance Abuse Task Force. Leslie is one of the members of the task force, and what we do is we strategize about substance abuse use, and more specifically for youth. So if you are interested, just let us know and we'll be glad to add you to the list and invite you to the next meeting. We're meeting on Zoom as well during this time.
And to add to that, we have 3 different committees that we've set up. One has to do with data, communications, and events. So while we'd love for you to come to or join us at every Zoom meeting, if you have a particular interest, you can be involved in many different ways. So if you do want more information, if you'd email us. Irene, do you want the email or?
Yeah, and I just got a message from Madison. She wants to be on that group, and she
Okay.
sent her email address. If you send me your email address, and maybe Judy has those addresses because she sent the invite for this meeting.
Right.
And yeah,
you
we'll
could-
be glad to, but if you don't send that on the text, you can contact any of us, and we'll be glad
Right.
to watch.
And an easy, memorable one is info@parstopeka.org. We'll get it. I guess, are there any other questions or, Dana, I'm going to put you on the spot, gaps that you see, because we do evaluations on kids, but then what happens? You know, that's a big thing, but, and I would ask anybody else to join in too, what they see as gaps.
Yeah, so the hardest thing, that my biggest struggle to this day is working with kids. I work with a lot of kids who are the ages of 17, 18, and 19, 20, some of them kind of the top end, that a lot of them, I wouldn't say a lot, they all have different circumstances, but for whatever reasons, they may not have health insurance, or they may not have a stable place to live. And there's a lot of barriers because they're an adult, but they're not really an adult yet. I use that term loosely. So legally we recognize them as an adult, but if they're, I've had some kids in the past who on the day they turned 18, their parents were like, see ya, you're on your own now, you're 18, go do your thing. And they were still in high school. And so trying to get them to manage all of those things and stay sober it's a huge feat. We do, if they qualify for residential treatment, then we have options for them, and we have options for them if they're not in residential treatment and doing outpatient treatment. But we gotta go back to that. If you don't have a steady place to live, you don't have a steady place to eat, you know, all of those things aren't met, then it's really hard to ask you to do all these other things too. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest gaps that I see in services. There are some ways around those things, but it's really hard to fight the system. The other thing right now, I don't know if it's a gap. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a gap, it's a struggle. We have one treatment center in the state of Kansas for juveniles, and prior to COVID, they had a capacity of 40. When COVID happened, they dropped down to a capacity of like 20, and they've now changed residencies, so they only have a capacity of 5 to 10 for the whole state. So funding is, yeah, it's really a struggle all the way across the board. So now we have kids that are going to automatically be in waiting for beds just to get into treatment, and sometimes we lose the momentum of getting them there. A lot of times they'll go to outpatient treatment before they can go to residential, and things happen. So that's probably one of the biggest struggles that I'm seeing right now.
Do juveniles go to treatment because it's court mandated usually, or do they check themselves in, or what's the breakdown on that?
Do all of the above. 9 times out of 10, if I'm sending a child to residential treatment because they qualify for a residential treatment bed, there's some kind of court order behind it. Meaning they're either on probation, they're on truancy, or they have a pending charge that's big enough that they know that if they don't go, that the judge is going to put them in prison. I would say probably 75% of the kids that go to residential treatment, that's the case. Outpatient treatment tends to be about a breakdown of 50-50, maybe 40-60. Some of them are on, right now, truancy is high for a multitude of different reasons. So we are, I do have some truant cases that are coming through. I'll be honest with you, I'm seeing more kids using right now. We may not see the evaluations reflecting it because the way that kids are referred to us is through the school system and through the legal system. Well, if they're not in the school system on a regular basis, their odds of getting caught and under the influence or in possession are going to go down. Truancy cases are, I'm starting to see a few more of those, but the legal side of things is slow, and that's just part of the system. And that's not the system's fault when you're overwhelmed and you have less, a huge caseload. It just is what it is. But I'm seeing kids now that are telling me, I didn't start using until COVID, and then I started using. So we're going to see it's going to peak. It's going to keep going up, at least for a while, until we can get a better grasp on it. Bill's here. I'm going to assume that the adult side is probably somewhat the same. Bill, you can probably speak more of that on your side of things than I can. Oh, that wasn't fair. I threw him under the bus and he didn't even know I was throwing him under the bus.
Sorry about that. Say that again.
I was talking that I've had a lot more kids reporting new usage since COVID. And so I didn't know if you were having a lot of relapses that were there as a result or as a coincidence of COVID, or what you guys were seeing with the adult side.
Well, it's been pretty steady. We reduced the number of beds from, 2 to a room down to 1. So that capped demand right there. And
right.
but not necessarily a spike, but more, intensity within cases, but not necessarily a spike. And it's just hard to tell because, we just limited capacity.
Yeah. With you guys, definitely. That makes a huge difference when you have to cut back your capacity.
Right. And keep up the great work, by the way. Everything you say is just spot on. And I appreciate
thank you.
Because I don't have that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Some of the people attending is just saying thank you, great presentation, and I guess they're ready to leave.
Well, thank you all for listening. I know it's not always a fun topic to listen to all of those not so great things happening in this world.
The only thing I'd add too, again, thanks for joining us, but we will be sending an email out for an evaluation and would really appreciate any ideas for future topics, conversations, workshop topics, that kind of thing. So would appreciate any feedback from you all on that. So thanks and have a great day the rest of the day.
Thank you all.